All right, you guys, back again with another reading hour. Sorry for the gap in between. Had a busy long weekend. Let's wait for Instagram to catch up here, and then we'll get started. All right, here we go. Back again with another reading hour. This is for July 22nd, 2025. So, picking back up here with the Gladio book. This next section here is The Macabre Grimace. The morning after John Paul made these alleged announcements, he was found dead under conditions that continue to baffle investigators. At 4:30 a.m., Sister Vincenza, following her morning routine, knocked at the door of the papal bedchambers and left a pot of coffee on a table in the hallway. When she returned a half hour later, she found the tray untouched. After knocking at the door and receiving no reply, she called out, "Buonasera, Papa." The room was still. Entering the room, she found the Pope sitting up in bed with his eyeglasses half off his nose. His fingers were clutched around a file, and papers were strewn among the bed covers. As soon as she approached him, Sister Vincenza reeled back in horror. The Pope's lips were pulled back in a macabre grimace. His gums were exposed, and his eyes appeared to have popped from their sockets. The nun shrieked with alarm and pulled a bell to summon Friar John McGee, John Paul's secretary. As soon as McGee saw the Pope's condition, he telephoned Cardinal Villot, who occupied an apartment within the Lateran Palace. Hmm. So he's always close by, this Villot. If you remember, this Cardinal Villot is like a nefarious character. He's definitely part of Gladio. Villot, according to Vatican sources, uttered in French the following cry of surprise: "Mon Dieu, c'est vrai tout ça or ca? I don't know how to speak French. My God, is that all true?" Then he asked McGee an extraordinary question, quote, "Does anybody else know the Holy Father is dead?" McGee replied on the phone that no one knew except the Vatican nun. Villot then told McGee that no one, not even Sister Vincenza, must be allowed to enter the Pope's bedroom, and that he, as the Vatican Camerlengo, the presiding cardinal, would handle matters as soon as he arrived. Interesting. Wonder why. Wonder why he needs that kind of exclusive access to the Pope's dead body. Certainly not suspicious at all. So this next section here is called Villot's Satchel. Villot appeared in a matter of moments. To McGee's amazement, the cardinal was shaved, well-groomed, and in full ecclesiastical attire. It seemed as though Villot was set to make a public appearance. The time was 5 a.m. So he got all done up to the nines to come and see the dead pope. The time was 5 a.m. Before proceeding with the rite of extreme unction, Villot began placing items from the Pope's bedroom in a satchel, including the vial of low blood pressure medicine that John Paul kept on a bedside table, the papers that were scattered on the bed covers, and the Pope's appointment book and last will. Finally, he removed John Paul's glasses and slippers. None of these things were ever seen again. Also very interesting, certainly not suspicious in any way, definitely not covering anything up, and this certainly has nothing to do with whatever announcement the Pope made that we talked about on our last reading hour. Let's see. I'm just scrolling up a little bit because I'm kind of interested. Let's see. John Paul had announced on September 28th his decision to remove Archbishop Marcinkus from the IOR, to transfer Cardinal Baggio to the Diocese of Florence, and to force Cardinal Villot into retirement. This contention is supported by declassified documents from the U.S. Department of State and the CIA. The presumed papal simpleton, remember, they thought this pope was just a weak idiot that they could use to their own ends, who ceaselessly spoke to his friends and associates about his fondness for Pinocchio, seemed suddenly set on becoming a real pope. It was 1978. The strategy of tension was still in effect. Aldo Moro remained intent on forming a coalition government with socialists and communists. Liberation theology continued to spread throughout Latin America, giving rise to left-wing guerrillas and left-wing governments. The CIA had lost its connection to their drug lords of Southeast Asia and was engaged in a new search for opium to fund its black operations. All matters, including the utilization of the offshore corporations set up by Sindona and Calvi, awaited final resolution. The timing could not be worse for an upheaval within the IOR. Okay, so yeah, the obvious solution, just whack this guy. Just whack this pope. Kind of funny. This next section here is a physician's pronouncement. Villot telephoned Dr. Renato Buzzanetti, the Vatican physician, and instructed McGee to make arrangements for the immediate transfer of Sister Vincenza to the cloistered environment of her mother house in Venice. At this point in the story, the nun disappeared. No investigator, not even John Cornwell, who became the official Vatican snoop in this case, was permitted to interview her. Cornwell was merely told that she had died shortly after arriving at the mother house. Wow. I wonder if they whacked her too. The British journalist accepted this explanation without question. Neither he nor any other reporter who probed into John Paul's death has been able to uncover the proper name of Sister Vincenza, let alone a reason for her abrupt dismissal from the Vatican. Dr. Buzzanetti arrived at 5:45, examined the body, and announced to McGee and Vallot that the Pope had suffered a, quote, coronary occlusion, that he had died between 10:30 and 11 the previous evening, and that he had suffered nothing. But the Holy Father's bulging eyes and horrific grimace seemed to tell a different story. Oof. Yeah, it does not sound good. Next section here is called Bizarre Postmortem. Shortly after the physician left, two morticians, Ernesto and Arnaldo Signoracci, appeared out of nowhere. Are they brothers? It was 6 a.m. Vallot must have summoned them as he received the call from Father McGee. That is, before 5 a.m., before he called Dr. Buzzanetti, and before he had even seen the body. What's more, the morticians had been transported to the Vatican by an official car that presumably had to be dispatched before Vallot entered the papal bedchamber. Okay, so he's got all these plans in the works, like as soon as he hears the Pope is dead. It's almost like he had kind of foreknowledge and a bunch of ideas already in place. It's not like he just spurred into action at the hearing of it. When Cornwell interviewed the Signoracci brothers, they were unable to confirm the time of their arrival. They only affirmed that it was early in the morning. Even though the bodies of the popes are traditionally not embalmed, the two morticians, under instructions from Vallot, began to inject embalming fluid into John Paul's body as soon as they arrived. That also doesn't sound like it's common practice to inject the body with embalming fluid right there before you even remove it or do any kind of examinations or anything like that. Continuing here, though, this unorthodox means of embalming without draining the corpse of blood would serve to prevent any possibility of a complete autopsy and any accurate determination of the cause of death. Also very convenient. The morticians also manipulated the distorted jaw of the Pope, corrected his horrible grimace, and closed his eyes. When interviewed by Cornwell, the brothers admitted that they said they are brothers. This sounds just so mafioso and obviously just beyond blatantly corrupt. When interviewed by Cornwell, the brothers admitted that they had opened the dead Pope's femoral arteries and injected an anti-putrid fluid before removing the body from the Vatican. They could not remember either the room or the place where they had performed this procedure. Also so curious, just weird. Very just weird. All very fishy. A fabricated story is the next section here. While the Pope's body was being infused with the fluid, Vallot instructed McGee to relate to the world a fabricated story about the morning's events. McGee was to say that he, not Sister Vincenza, had found the Pope's body. He was to make no mention of the papers that were strewn across the bed or the items that Vallot tucked away in his satchel. What's more, in order to provide a proper ecclesiastical spin to the tale, McGee was to say that John Paul had died with a copy of the Imitation of Christ, the great devotional work by St. Thomas à Kempis, clutched in his hand. At 6:30 a.m., Vallot conveyed the news of the Pope's death to Cardinal Carlo Confalonieri, the 86-year-old dean of the Sacred College. Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, sorry, I'm having a little trouble with the Italian names for some reason this morning, head of the Vatican Diplomatic Corps, and Sergeant Hans Roggen of the Swiss Guards. Okay, so I guess they're the first people informed of the Pope's death. The news was beginning to spread throughout the Vatican village. At 6:45 a.m., Sergeant Roggen came upon Archbishop Marcinkus in a courtyard near the Vatican Bank. This was most unusual. Marcinkus, who lived 20 minutes from the Vatican in the Villa Strich, was a late riser who never appeared at his office before 9 a.m. When the sergeant blurted out the news, Marcinkus stared at Roggen, displayed no emotion, and made no comment. Later, when questioned by Cornwell about his lack of reaction, Marcinkus offered this explanation. Quote, I thought he, meaning Roggen, said, hey, I dreamed the Pope was dead. So he thought it was just a dream. Also very fishy and not suspicious whatsoever. This is so beyond obvious, what has happened. Somebody called in the hit on this Pope who was about to shake up the whole Gladio op, and then all these people's reactions and very immediate plans are pretty indicative of that. It's pretty blatant. But again, when you just kill any investigators or you ship them off somewhere where they're never to be heard from again, I guess you can get away with doing that. At 7:27 a.m., nearly 3 hours after Sister Vincenza discovered the Pope's body, Vatican Radio made the following announcement. Vatican Radio, sorry. I don't know why I thought it was a person. Vatican Radio made the following announcement. Quote, this morning, September 29th, 1978, about 5:30, the private secretary of the Pope, contrary to custom not having found the Holy Father in the chapel of his private apartment, looked for him in his room and found him dead in bed with a light on, like one who was intent on reading. The physician, Dr. Renato Buzzanetti, who hastened to the Pope's room, verified the death, which took place presumably toward 11 o'clock yesterday evening, as quote sudden death that could be related to acute myocardial infarction. This next section here is the story unravels. Despite Cardinal Valot's care in fabricating the fiction, the story quickly began to unravel upon inspection. The first problem came with the imitation of Christ. John Paul's copy could not be found within the papal apartment. It remained among his belongings in Venice, where he had served as patriarch. On October 2nd, the Vatican was forced to admit that the Holy Father was not reading the Imitation of Christ at the time of his demise, but rather was holding in his hands certain sheets of paper containing his personal writings such as homilies, speeches, reflections, and various notes. On October 5th, after continual badgering from the press, the Vatican came clean and admitted that the papers the Holy Father was clutching concerned his decision to make critical changes within the Roman Curia, including the Vatican Bank. The second problem came with the work of the morticians. Italian law dictated that no embalming should be undertaken until 24 hours after death, without dispensation from a magistrate. For this reason, the immediate injection of, quote, anti-putrid fluid into the body of the Pope without draining the blood smacked of foul play. Yeah, very obviously. It's like, again, just beyond blatant. On October 1st, Corriere della Sera, Milan's daily newspaper, published a front-page story titled, quote, Why Say No to an Autopsy? The story called for a complete disclosure of all facts relating to the Pope's death and concluded by saying, the Church has nothing to fear, therefore nothing to lose. Yeah, if you have nothing to hide, you should have nothing to fear from inspection, right? The old adage. On the contrary, it would have much to gain. Now, to know what the Pope died of is of a legitimate historical fact. It is part of our visible history and does not in any way affect the spiritual mystery of his death. The body that we leave behind when we die can be understood with our poor instruments. It is a leftover. The soul is already, or rather it has always been, dependent on other laws which are not human, and so remain inscrutable. Let us not make out of a mystery a secret to guard for earthly reasons, and let us recognize the smallness of our secrets. Let us not declare sacred what is not. Yeah, so a very sensible proclamation and plea to the Vatican, to the investigators involved. Basically, just like let the facts come forward. Why hide any of this? Why all the fishiness? Yeah, all very sensible questions. This next section here is no cardiopathic symptoms. These demands intensified when John Paul's personal physicians said that the Pope was in good health. Quote, he had absolutely no cardiopathic characteristics, Dr. Carlo Frizziero said. Quote, besides his low blood pressure should, in theory, have made him safe from acute cardiovascular attacks. The only time I needed to give him treatment was for the influenza attack. This diagnosis was verified by Dr. Antonio da Rose, who examined the Pope on Saturday, September 23rd, and told the press, quote, non sta bene ma benone. He is not well, but very well. Oh, so he's not well, but very well. I guess he's just emphasizing the guy's fine. Okay. So the Pope he was just fit as a fiddle. I'm probably sure, it sounds like he was more fit than Trump. I don't know, to be, everybody's like talking for like 5 minutes about him having some kind of like Venus something or other. It's like amazing how fast things blow through the news cycle here, and they're like news for one day, if that. The Pope's good physical condition was attributed to his lifestyle. He exercised regularly, never smoked, drank alcohol only rarely, and kept a healthy diet. At the time of his death, John Paul was 65. Numerous heart specialists throughout the world, including Dr. Christian Barnard of South Africa and Dr. Seamus Bonham of London, took to task Dr. Buzzanetti's diagnosis of myocardial infarction without conducting an autopsy as incredible and preposterous. Such critiques caused Valot to concoct another story. He told his fellow cardinals who pressed for an autopsy that the real cause of John Paul's death was not a heart attack. The Holy Father, he assured them, had unwittingly taken a fatal overdose of Effertil, his blood pressure medicine. If an autopsy was conducted, Valot said, it would give rise to the belief that the Pope had committed suicide. Okay. So definitely not fishy at all that he has to come up with an entire second controverting story. But this next section here is called Canon Lies. When this explanation failed to quiet the clamor for an autopsy, Villot proclaimed that canon law expressly prohibited the body of a pope from being subjected to post-mortem surgery. This statement gave rise to yet another problem. Canon law neither banned nor condoned papal autopsies, but failed to address the subject. What's more, scholars quickly pointed out that an autopsy had been performed on the body of Pius VII in 1830. Rumor quickly became rampant that John Paul had died of poisoning. Some speculated that a lethal dosage of digitalis had been added to the effertil, the liquid medicine for low blood pressure the Pope kept by his bedside. Such a mixture would induce vomiting that would account for the necessity of Villot's removal of the Pope's glasses and slippers. Oh, I guess they would have evidence of the vomit. Brother Fabian, the Vatican pharmacist, used this theory to provide a final explanation for the Pope's demise. John Paul, he said, was taking digoxin for a heart problem and could have swallowed a few pills before taking a slug of effertil, with tragic results. But this explanation also proved to be bogus. John Paul had never received a prescription for digoxin. That drug had been used by Paul VI. So this next section here is Fe un Polacco, or Palacho. On Monday, October 16, 1978, the CIA's plans came to fruition as its dark horse candidate ascended to the papal throne as John Paul II. Also, just remember here, the CIA does have a heart attack gun. They've admitted to this. They admitted to that in like the fucking 80s or 70s. It's like an old video. You can find it on YouTube. It's like, just search CIA heart attack gun. And it's some guy who's testifying in some kind of hearing. And he's like, yeah, the CIA just has this gun. They can fire it at you from some kind of distance, but it's got like these tiny little ice pellets. And the ice breaks your skin, gets into your bloodstream, and in the ice is like a high dosage of the toxin that is in shellfish that causes people to like, who are allergic to shellfish, to like really swell up and it kills them. They have such a high amount of it that even if you're not allergic to them, it will cause that same reaction. You'll just have a heart attack. And it looks like some kind of just natural heart attack because the ice pellet dissolves, it melts in your skin. It leaves like this tiny little red mark that's like imperceptible and will never be noticed by anybody who does an autopsy on you. So yeah, when high level people like this or operatives of some kind that are a threat to the CIA in some way just have random heart attacks that aren't, conducive with their health status, with like what they are, the kind of shape they're actually in. It's not just random. The news of the selection of Karol Wojtyla's election, so I guess that's John Paul II's real name, caught the teeming crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square by surprise. The people expected the election of some established member of the Vatican bureaucracy, such as the progressive Cardinal Bonelli or the conservative Cardinal Siri. They were stunned to hear the name of Wojtyla. Even members of the press turned to one another to ask, "Who is Wojtyla?" His strange-sounding name led many to believe that the new pope might be an African or Asian. Eventually, Friar Andrew Greeley of Chicago told them, "È un Polacco." He's a Pole. Oh my God, that's the word for a Polish person in Italian is Polacco. That's very funny. It was one thing to elect a Pole, such as the famous anti-communist Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski, but quite another to elect one about whom so little was known. Who was Wojtyla? How had a junior cardinal come to the throne in less than 2 days of balloting? Not only was the election unexpected, but the new pope also looked unusual as a Holy Father. He lacked the delicate, almost effete features of Paul VI and Pius XII. His hulking physical frame and his non-intellectual mannerisms seemed to some observers antithetical to the Roman grace and refinement of many of his predecessors. So he just looks like a brute. Weird. This, quote, lack of refinement came to the fore during his first public appearance. Wojtyla, as John Paul II, approached a group of American reporters and beseeched them with the folded hands of a penitent to be, quote, good to him. A few minutes later, in a further effort to ingratiate himself with the press, the new pope cupped his hands like a megaphone and shouted his blessing to the milling crowd like a cheerleader at a football game. So now they've switched in the text from Wojtyla to Wojtyla. So I don't know what the guys and they're switching back again to Wojtyla later. I'm going to keep saying Wojtyla. They both sound weird. So this next section here is the unknown Wojtyla. Gradually, the public came to learn that Wojtyla, as a young man, had sought not to become a priest but an actor. They further learned that he had worked in a chemical factory under Nazi control during World War II, although no one knew for certain if he had been the leader of, quote, an underground movement which assisted Jews or a Nazi collaborator. Hmm. It's a shame you can't just like ask him and get like an honest answer about what his role was. Rumors persisted that he had developed romantic attachments to many women and may have been married. The alleged marriage helped to explain the so-called Great Gap in John Paul's career, the 5-year span of time between 1939 and 1944. Oh, what an odd time to have like a gap as well. But certain things about the new pope eventually came to light. Cardinal Velo, Cardinal Velo and the quote Masonic cardinals had engineered his campaign with the help of American cardinals Cody and Kroll, and celebrated his election not with traditional Te Deums and official prayers, but rather a gala champagne party in which the new Holy Father filled the empty glasses of the nearest cardinals and nuns while warbling his favorite song, a Polish number called The Mountaineer. After the coronation, the Vatican Incorporated returned to business as usual. Cardinal Velo remained Secretary of State, and Archbishop Marcinkus returned to his position as head of the IOR. The ties to Roberto Calvi, Licio Gelli, and the CIA were renewed, and the time became right for a deal with the Turks. Okay, so I guess that's going to be like their next source of heroin is Turkey. So that's cool. Am I at 20 minutes? Yeah, I'm at 21 minutes. So I will bookmark this one here for today. Let's see. It's giving me trouble. Sorry, you guys. Silly. All right, I'm going to switch over now to the Western Marxism book. So when we last left off, it's going to be this section here, section 5, or maybe chapter 5, with Arendt from the Third World to the Western Hemisphere. The turning point in Arendt with the outbreak of the Cold War is not just an issue of the past. Let's jump 2 decades from when the first edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism was published. These were the years when the world anti-colonial revolution manifested itself even in the United States through the African American liberation struggle. The Third World demanded the end of a centuries-long chapter of colonialism, neocolonialism, and white supremacy, politically, economically, and ideologically. It was against this tumultuous movement of colonies, semi-colonies, colonial peoples, and peoples of colonial origin that the philosopher took her position with a peremptory declaration, quote, "The Third World is not a reality, but an ideology." That's a hell of a claim to make. That is a hell of a claim to make, Miss Arendt. That all those people existing in the state of actual poverty, of underdevelopment, of exploitation, that's just an ideological construct. That's not a real material condition. In an interview, she repeated this declaration just a few years later, quote, "I am truly of the opinion that the Third World is exactly what I said, an ideology or an illusion. Africa, Asia, South America, those are realities." Okay, so what is your fucking point? Like, but if the Third World is an ideological abstraction, why should Asia constitute, quote, a reality? We are speaking here of political realities. It would be absurd to contrast Asia as a geographical category to the Third World, which is clearly a political category. Indeed, when Arendt made her declaration, Asia was embracing contrasting political realities. The income disparity that separated Japan from the less developed countries was enormous, and the horror with which the empire of the rising sun had stained itself in attempting to colonize and enslave its Asian neighbors was still a living memory. A few years before the declaration we have just seen, in condemning the revolutions that arose in the wake of Marx and Lenin in her book On Revolution, the philosopher expressed with abandon another peremptory statement, quote, "Human life has been stricken with poverty since times immemorial, and mankind continues to labor under this curse in all countries outside the Western Hemisphere." Quote, "Western Hemisphere. Under a single category, the most disparate sociopolitical realities are mixed together. The most advanced industrial country and other countries that at that moment were more than ever afflicted by underdevelopment and mass misery. The superpower that, based on the Monroe Doctrine, arrogated to itself the right to sovereign intervention in Latin America, the countries that were forced to suffer such interventions and the semi-colonial condition that came with them. On Revolution cites James Monroe only once, and that citation unequivocally treats him as a champion of the cause of freedom." So yeah, I mean, you can't be more blatantly Western white supremacist bias than to, in your book about this shit, cite Monroe only once and to call him a good guy. To not mention the Monroe Doctrine, like, no mention is made of the slaves that were his property, nor to the doctrine that goes by his name and that allows the neocolonial domination of the entire continent by the North American Republic over the, quote, Western Hemisphere. Justified in the name of rejecting, quote, abstraction, the flight from the third world landed Arendt on a much more abstract entity in sociopolitical terms. Yet this second abstraction hinted at a specific country, about which the philosopher again expressed herself peremptorily. Quote, the colonialism and imperialism of European nations, that is the one great crime in which America was never involved. It's funny how fucking stupid and dishonest this shit is. And then people still buy it. Like, people will take Arendt seriously and they act like they are serious people. In this view, with an incredible lack of focus, there is no room for the war against Mexico and the dismemberment of that country, for the conquest of the Philippines and the merciless repression of its independence movement, and the often explicit celebration of the genocide against the American Indians. And so we encounter Arendt's most blatant erasure of history, the expropriation and decimation of the native population to steal their lands, which were to be cultivated in many cases by black slaves transported from Africa in the course of a voyage with extremely high mortality rates. Not by accident did this chapter of history inspire Adolf Hitler, who identified the, quote, indigenous of Eastern Europe with the Indians of America to be expropriated and decimated to make possible the Germanization of the conquered territories, while the survivors were destined to work as slaves in the service of the master race. And yet this chapter of history, which coincided with the rise and period of the West's colonial expansion and all its horrors, had, according to Arendt, nothing to do, at least regarding the initial phase of American history, with the history of colonialism. Yeah, again, it's just like I'm like at a loss for words for how stupid that is. Like, I want to start using slurs for how fucking stupid that is to claim. But again, people still take this person seriously. People will still say, like, read Arendt when they say that Stalin was bad, when they say that the USSR was bad, that China or Mao were bad. These are not serious people. They are just white supremacists masking themselves as progressives. And you should not only take them seriously, like, you shouldn't allow them any kind of, like, space. Like, these are people that need to go away. So let's see. At the turn of the 20th century, an illustrious British politician and historian observed that Tocqueville's Democracy in America, quote, is not so much a political study as a work of edification. In this latter category, we may also place Arendt's On Revolution. We have two texts that celebrate the founding of the United States as the greatest chapter in the history of freedom, without a word devoted to the fact that the newborn North American Republic sanctioned black slavery in its constitution and for decades saw the slave owners exercise a decisive influence over its political institutions. Quote, at a time when the movement for the abolition of slavery was already well underway on both sides of the Atlantic, the institution of slavery, politically and constitutionally triumphant, assumed its cruelest form. White slave owners could sell, like goods or cattle, the individual members of the black families that were their property. Published shortly after the first great anti-colonial revolution, that of Saint-Domingue in Haiti, which Arendt disparages, of course she would disparage that, Democracy in America expresses admiration for the United States, which sought to reduce the country governed by former slaves to starvation and force it to capitulate. On Revolution saw the light of day at the height of the worldwide anti-colonial revolution. Its author reacted in the same way as Tocqueville. She condemned the revolution and erected a monument to the superpower that sought to strangle it by any means. Notwithstanding all this, Arendt continues to greatly influence Western Marxism. Yeah, very sadly. We will see that the thesis that colonialism and imperialism are foreign to the United States was uncritically reprised by Hart and Negri. We can say that Arendt's path, flight from the anti-colonial revolution and the Third World, and ending up in the, quote, Western Hemisphere, and its mythically transfigured leading country, was the same route taken by the two authors of Empire. So this next section here, or chapter 6, is Foucault and the removal of colonial peoples from history. Along with Arendt, another author made Western Marxism's break with the anti-colonial revolution irreparable. In the 1960s, Althusser credited him with being the most prestigious Marxist philosopher of the times. I refer to Michel Foucault. Thanks to his analysis of the pervasiveness, or rather the omnipresence of power, not only in institutions and social relations, but also in the conceptual apparatus, he emanated an aura of fascinating radicalism that allowed for reckoning with the power and the idiocracy, and not idiocracy like the movie, maybe it's idiocracy, with reckoning with the power and idiocracy at the foundation of actually existing socialism, as its crisis grew ever more serious. Actually, his radicalism is not merely ostensible, it becomes its opposite. The gesture of condemning every power relation, indeed every form of power in both society and in discourse about society, made problematic or even impossible the quote determinate negation, the bestimmte negation, that very negation of a quote determinate content, that for Hegel is the precondition of a real transformation of society, the precondition of the revolution. Further, this Foucauldian effort to identify and demystify domination in all its forms reveals surprising lacunae, precisely where domination manifests itself in all its brutality. Attention to colonial domination is scarce or non existent. So, yeah, I guess that's a very wordy and philosophical way of saying that, like, if you just point to all forms of oppression and you just boil them all down to being like equally bad, that allows people who are suffering some forms of oppression, you know, obviously in the imperial core, to equate their suffering with the suffering that they are benefiting from in a very material way. It allows them to feel that like they are the working class just as much as people in sweatshops that are making their stuff are working class. They're all just proletarians. We're all just suffering. We're all just the same. Uh, Class analysis be damned. Material relations doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Foucault seems not to have been associated with the protest initiated by Sartre over the massacre of Algerians in Paris, a protest in which his friend Pierre Boulez participated. More generally, he does not play any role in the struggle against torture and the ferocious repression with which power sought to destroy the national liberation struggle in Algeria. It has been justly observed regarding Foucault that his quote critique of power, that quote his critique of power continues to look to Europe. Yeah, it's just like focus merely on the imperial courts. It's like our suffering, because it's the one that I'm seeing every day or the one that I'm personally experiencing. That is the only one that I will possibly talk or care about or philosophize about. In his work, the colonial peoples and those of colonial origin are historically absent. This explains his sentiment or his statement that at the end of the 18th century, quote, in Europe and in the United States, the entire economy of punishment was redistributed. This period saw the quote disappearance of torture as a public spectacle, and quote the great public ritualization of death gradually began to disappear. The periodization suggested references to the torture inflicted in 1757 on Robert Francois Damiens, author of a failed assassination attempt on Louis XV, and described by Foucault with devotion to the gruesome details. But if we insert African Americans into the picture, we must say that between the end of the 18th century and the early 20th century, we find not the disappearance so much as the triumph of, quote, torture as a public spectacle, end quote, of the ritualization of death. Yeah, again, if you just totally ignore the commonplace lynchings that are a fucking celebration for these racist white supremacist villages, yeah, you can pretend that we are in a much more modern, civilized era. These methods are how white supremacy in the United States punished blacks accused of making attempts on the sexual and racial purity of white women. Notices of lynchings were printed in local papers, and extra cars were added to trains for spectators from miles around, sometimes thousands of them. School children might get a day off to attend the lynching. The spectacle could include castration, skinning, roasting, hanging, and shooting. Souvenirs for purchasers might include fingers, toes, teeth, and bones, even the genitals of the victim, as well as picture postcards of the event. Yeah, save that one for later, folks. Post that online and get some likes and clicks if you want. We are far from Foucault's reconstruction of the history of the quote economy of punishment in Europe and the United States, and from the modern soul that the French philosopher describes. He writes that quote punishment had gradually ceased to be a spectacle in the first decades of the 19th century, and whatever theatrical elements it still retained were now downgraded. In reality, as regarded African Americans between the 19th and 20th centuries, torture and death were made into spectacles to an unprecedented degree, and these practices, far from being exceptional, such as an attempt on the life of a head of state, became a nearly daily experience. Yeah, again, these are not like Foucault was saying because people who like make failed assassination attempts aren't publicly tortured, flogged, drawn and quartered, or whatever. That therefore we're in a new modern age and we've transcended all that stuff, and now the repression and the subjugation of the state and authorities has transmogrified. It's transformed and mutated itself into this like ever-present but subtle power relationship stuff that you're experiencing, and it's just like the background that you live under. Meanwhile, ignore these daily spectacles of the people coming from thousands and thousands of people watching some person be hung, tortured, all the gruesome things I was describing. It's like, it's the whole point of this is we are not that far from any of this shit. All right, I'll do like 5 more minutes on this book. Let's see. So another chapter, chapter 7, Foucault and the esoteric history of racism. All that is ignored by the French philosopher, and this is not by accident. He paints a bizarre history. He paints a bizarre picture of the history of racism, and indeed so bizarre as to be esoteric. In brief, quote, in the mid-19th century, in contrast to all the traditional historiography that seeks to consecrate sovereignty, we find in France an entirely new discourse, anti-authoritarian and revolutionary, that divides society into races or classes in struggle and introduces, quote, a principle of heterogeneity. The history of some is not the history of others. But sometime later, we arrive at a watershed. Quote, the idea of race, with its monistic, statist, and biological implications, will replace the idea of racial struggle. It is a complete reversal. Quote, racism represents literally revolutionary discourse, but in reverse. I mean, that feels like it has some kind of sense of truth to it. It's like, but that just is another way of saying that racism is counter-revolutionary. Racism is reactionary. It's like, no shit. However, rest assured that these new ideas, quote, had their roots in the discourse of race struggle. This is how Foucault would explain the tragedy and the horror of the 20th century. The Third Reich, quote, takes up the theme, established at the end of the 19th century, of a state racism that is responsible for the biological protection of the race. Regarding the country founded by the October Revolution, quote, in Soviet state racism, what revolutionary discourse designated as the class enemy becomes a sort of biological threat. This reconstruction raises several problems. First, did, quote, state racism break out not only in the 20th century, in the 20th century? Putting this periodization in doubt well before then, the 19th century abolitionists burned the U.S. Constitution in the public square, calling it a pact with the devil for having consecrated racial slavery. Those abolitionists also violated the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which forced every U.S. American citizen to become a hunter of human beings. The law made it a punishable offense not only to have hidden or otherwise aided black people pursued by their legitimate owners, but also to not assist with their capture. Get ready for those laws to make a resurgence. I could easily see that happening. Could you not? To be fair to Foucault, we might say that he is ignorant of this history, but he had only to read the comment by Marx on the Fugitive Slave Law, quote, to play the part of slave catchers for the Southern slaveholders appeared to be the constitutional calling of the North. In any case, we are not discussing a form of racism that manifested itself only in civil society. Based on explicit constitutional and legal norms, race determined an individual's social status and fate, determined and sanctioned by law. We are clearly in the presence of, quote, state racism. If the thesis that, quote, state racism made its first appearance in the 20th century is without any basis, it is at least indisputable that with the rise of the Third Reich, quote, we have reached an absolutely racist state. The particular horror that marked Hitler's Germany, the horror of the Holocaust, is beyond question. But this is not really the main issue here. We read in an authoritative U.S. American historian of racism that, quote, the Nazi definition of a Jew was never as stringent as the one drop rule that prevailed in the categorization of Negroes in racial purity laws of the American South. The definition of a Jew, based on the Nuremberg laws, was also based on this or that ancestor being a member of the Jewish religion, while in the United States, religion played no role in the definition of who was black. It was instead blood, even one drop of blood, that mattered. If we then examine the antebellum United States, we are forced to reach a conclusion. State racism emerged there more clearly than even in the Third Reich. Hitler did not possess slaves, either black or Jewish, while, as we know, for the first decade of the history of the North American Republic, almost all of the presidents owned black slaves. But in Foucault's version of the history of racism, there is no place for African Americans, nor for the colonial peoples or those of colonial origin who are left out entirely. In this way, our understanding of Nazism is compromised. We see Nazism's principal ideologue, Alfred Rosenberg, 3 years before Hitler's rise to power, refer to the, quote, racial state that was alive and well in the U.S. South as a model to keep in mind when building the racial state in Germany. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we definitely say it a lot in Marxist-Leninist circles, like all the tankies kind of circulate that idea. all the time, but I feel like liberals just have no idea still that Hitler modeled his whole thing after the U.S. Like he was literally like idolizing the way the U.S. exterminated people and tried to emulate it. He's very, very like explicit about it, like very obvious. All right, I'm at 40 minutes, so I'm going to bookmark this one here. And now we will switch over to The Soviets Expected It. This is again by Anna Louise Strong. And this one is basically just like describing what life was actually like in the Soviet Union during World War II, during the fight against the Nazis. And it's very humanizing. Definitely is great at dispelling the propaganda people think of. So continuing here, 2,000 people sat in the Great White Hall of the Kremlin Palace while Stalin made his report to the Congress of Soviets. Below me, where I sat in the journalist's box, was the main floor filled with the Congress deputies. Around me, in the loges, sat the foreign diplomatic corps. Behind me, in a deep gallery, were citizen visitors. Outside the hall, tens of millions of people listened over the radio, from the southern cotton fields of Central Asia to the scientific stations on the Arctic coast. It was a high point of Soviet history, but Stalin's words were direct and simple, and as informal as if he sat at a fireside talking with a few friends. He explained the significance of the Constitution, took up these suggested amendments, referred a large number of them to various lawmaking bodies, and himself discussed the most important. He made it plain that every one of those 154,000 suggestions had been classified somewhere and would influence something. Among the dozen or more amendments which Stalin personally discussed, he approved of those that facilitated democratic expression and disapproved of those that limited democracy. Some people felt, for instance, that the different constituent republics should not be granted the right to secede from the Soviet Union. Stalin said that, while they probably would not want to secede, their right to do so should be constitutionally guaranteed as an assertion of democracy. A fairly large number of people wanted to refuse political rights to the priests lest they influence politics unduly. Quote, "The time has come to introduce universal suffrage without limitations," said Stalin, arguing that the Soviet people were now mature enough to know their own minds. It's crazy. It's like I always reference Soviet Democracy, episode 37 of Rolls of the Roundtable podcast from back in the day, describing literally how Stalin pushed for more democracy and more, sovereignty for Soviet people at every turn. It's literally what he always did. More important for us today than constitutional forms, or even the question of how they work, was one very significant note in Stalin's speech. He ended by a direct challenge to the growing Nazi threat in Europe. Speaking on November 25, 1936, before Hitlerism was seriously opposed by any European government, Stalin called the new Soviet constitution, quote, an indictment against fascism, an indictment which says that socialism and democracy are invincible. In the years since the Constitutional Congress, Stalin's own personality began to be more widely known. His picture and slogans became so prominent in the Soviet Union that foreigners found this quote, idolatry, forced and insincere. Most Soviet folk of my acquaintance really do feel tremendous devotion to Stalin as the man who has built our country and led it to success. I have even known people to make a temporary change of residence just before Election Day in order to have the chance to vote for Stalin directly in the district where he was running, instead of for the less exciting candidate from their own district. No information about Stalin's home life is ever printed in Soviet newspapers. By Russian tradition, everybody, even a political leader, is entitled to the privacy of his personal life. A very delicate line divides private life from public work. When Stalin's wife died, the black-bordered death notices in the paper mentioned her by her own name, which was not Stalin's, listed her work in connection with various public organizations, and the fact that she was the, quote, friend and comrade of Stalin. They did not mention that she was his wife. The fact that she worked with him and might influence his decisions as a comrade was a public matter. The fact that she was married to him was their own affair. Sometime later, he was known to have married again, but the press never mentioned it. Glimpses of Stalin's personal relations come chiefly through his contacts with picturesque figures who have helped make Soviet history. Valery Chkalov, sorry, it's a tough one for me. Valery Chkalov, the brilliant aviator who made the first flight across the North Pole from Moscow to America, told of an afternoon that he spent at Stalin's summer home from 4 o'clock till after midnight. Stalin sang many Volga songs, put on gramophone records for the younger people to dance, and generally behaved like a normal human being, relaxing in the heart of his family. He said he had learned the songs in his Siberian exile when there wasn't much to do but sing. The three women aviators who broke all world records for women by their spectacular flight from Moscow to the Far East were later entertained at an evening party at the Kremlin in their honor. One of them, Raskova, related afterwards how Stalin had joked with them about the prehistoric days of the matriarchate when women ruled human society. He said that in the early days of human development, women had created agriculture as a basis for society and progress, while men, quote, only hunted and went to war. After a reference to the long subsequent centuries of women's slavery, Stalin added, quote, now these three women come to avenge the heavy centuries of women's suppression. Yeah, he just sounds like a good guy. He sounds like a great guy that you would want to hang out with, that has good takes, has good opinions. Yeah. The best tale, I think, is that about Marie Demchenko, because it shows Stalin's idea of leaders and of how they are produced. Marie was a peasant woman who came to a farm congress in Moscow and made a personal pledge to Stalin, then sitting on the platform, that her brigade of women would produce 20 tons of beets per acre that year. It was a spectacular promise, since the average yield in the Ukraine was about 5 tons. Marie's challenge started a competition among the Ukrainian sugar beet growers. It was featured by the Soviet press. The whole country followed with considerable excitement Marie's fight against a pest of moths. The nation watched the local fire department bring 20,000 pails of water to feed to the field to beat the drought. They saw that gang of women weed the fields 9 times and clear them 8 times of insects. Marie finally got 21 tons per acre, while the best of her competitors got 23. That's crazy. The harvest was a national event, so Marie's whole gang went to Moscow to visit Stalin at the autumn celebration. The newspapers treated them like movie stars and featured their conversation. Stalin asked Marie what she most wanted as a reward for her own good record and for stirring up all the other sugar beet growers. Marie replied that she had wanted most of all to come to Moscow and see quote the leaders. But now you yourselves are leaders, said Stalin to Marie. Well, yes, said Marie, but we wanted to see you anyway. Her final request, which was granted, was to study in an agricultural university. When the German war was launched against the Soviet Union, many foreigners were surprised that Stalin did not make a speech to arouse the people at once. Some of our more sensational papers assumed that Stalin had fled. Soviet people knew that Stalin trusted them to do their jobs. Soviet people knew that Stalin trusted them to do their jobs and that he would sum up the situation for them as soon as it crystallized. He did it at dawn on July 3rd in a radio talk. The words with which he began were very significant. Quote, comrades, citizens, he said, as he has said often. Then he added, brothers and sisters. It was the first time Stalin ever used in public those close family words. To everyone who heard them, those words meant that the situation was very serious, that they must now face the ultimate test together, and that they must all be closer and dearer to each other than they had ever been before. It meant that Stalin wanted to put a supporting arm across their shoulders, giving them strength for the task they had to do. This task was nothing less than to accept in their own bodies the shock of the most hellish assault of history, to withstand it, to break it, and by breaking it, save the world. They knew they had to do it, and Stalin knew they would. Stalin made perfectly plain that the danger was grave, that the German armies had taken most of the Baltic states, that the struggle would be very costly, and that the issues were between, quote, freedom or slavery, life or death to the Soviet state. He told them, quote, the enemy is cruel and implacable. He is out to seize our lands, watered with our sweat, to convert our peoples into the slaves of German princes and barons. He called upon the quote, daring initiative and intelligence that are inherent in our people, which he himself for more than 20 years had helped to create. He outlined in some detail the bitter path that they should follow, each in his own region, and said that they would find allies among the freedom-loving peoples of the world. Then he summoned them forward, quote, forward to victory. Erskine Caldwell, reporting that dawn from Moscow, said that tremendous crowds stood in the city squares listening to the loudspeakers, quote, holding their breath in such profound silence that one could hear every inflection of Stalin's voice. Twice during the speech, even the sound of water being poured into a glass could be heard as Stalin stopped to drink. For several minutes after Stalin had finished, the silence continued. Then a motherly-looking woman said, quote, he works so hard. I wonder when he finds time to sleep. I am worried about his health. That was the way that Stalin took the Soviet people into the test of war. Yeah. Yeah, it really makes him sound like a decent dude. When you think about it, think about the guy who it's like if you put Hitler on one end, Stalin on the other. It's like whenever I have to defend Stalin online, that's my quick go-to. He beat Hitler. What do you want? So this next chapter here is 4, Building for Total Defense. Quote, how do the Soviet people, who admittedly couldn't run a tractor if you gave them one, but just left it rusting in the field, suddenly appear with thousands of tanks efficiently handled? Was the question that a New York editor asked me at the beginning of the Soviet-German War. The answer is found in a 24-year national policy, and especially in the 3 5-year plans promoted by Stalin. The new Soviet state inherited in 1917 a country broken by the strain of the First World War. Tsarist Russia, with its enormous army, so unsupported by any adequate economic base in the hinterland, was the first country to crack under the strain. Quote, peace, land, and bread was the cry of the country. 4 successive cabinets failed to satisfy it, and this brought the Bolsheviks to power. The starving, war-exhausted land secured no peace. It was attacked by the armies of all the capitalist world. Moscow and Leningrad and the central part of Russia were separated by attacking armies from their chief food and fuel bases for 2.5 years. The granary of the Ukraine, the coal of the Donets, the oil of Baku, the mines of the Urals, the cotton of Turkestan were in enemy hands. Yeah, I'm sure it's not a coincidence that all those same places keep coming up even in current events and current conflicts. So weird that those places are rich in resources and they keep being centers of conflict. At the height of the foreign intervention, Soviet Russia was invaded by armies of 14 countries. It may be worthwhile today to note how much this determined country can suffer and still survive. When I first went to Moscow in the autumn of 1921, the countryside was full of thousands of peasant refugees fleeing on foot from the starving Volga Valley. In the Minsk station, I saw a Red Guard barefoot, dangling his rifle on a bit of rope. In Moscow, no streetcars were running, no street lamps lit, and the water pressure did not rise above the second floor in my hotel. In once prosperous farming regions along the Volga, half-naked children huddled all winter long on top of the family ovens in villages, starving without candles, dying in the dark. Out of those bitter years, the Soviet leaders came to the conclusion that at whatever cost, they must make their country economically independent and strong enough to defend itself against the world. War is implacable, said Lenin. Quote, it puts the question with merciless sharpness. Either perish or overtake the advanced countries and surpass them. This is how history has put the question. Yeah, that is like where the question of development comes into play, productive forces, like all these things that like sound like they're quotes from Deng Xiaoping and they're actually quotes from Lenin saying like, participate in the world economy if you have to. Learn from the capitalists how to build things if you have to. You have to build up your productive forces. Like you don't have any choice but to do these things. And war makes that very clear. War sharpens the contradiction better than anything else. Like you either have to do these things or you will quite literally die. Let's see. Yeah, I'll do like 7 more minutes here. Sorry, I gotta block a bot. Could a backward peasant land like Russia, with neither funds nor trained people, build up from its own resources great publicly owned industries? Could it overtake economically the older and more advanced nations and become independent and secure? This was the chief question whose discussion racked the country, and especially the ruling Communist Party during those years. It was the famous discussion about, quote, building socialism in one country. Trotsky held that Russia could not do it, that unless the surrounding capitalist powers were overthrown by revolution, they would inevitably overwhelm the young socialist commonwealth. He therefore advocated that the Soviet state devote itself primarily to fomenting revolution, especially in Germany. Stalin's view, which was increasingly held by the majority, was that the Soviet people could create a strong and independent state out of their own resources through publicly owned enterprises. Such a state might be regarded by the capitalist powers with hostility, but if it handled its foreign relations astutely, and especially if it refrained from mixing in the internal affairs of other nations, it might secure a fairly long period of peace in which to strengthen itself for whatever the future might hold. He proposed, therefore, to put the main emphasis on the rapid building of modern heavy industry, the rapid modernization of farming, and the creation of an armed and nation-conscious people out of an illiterate population speaking more than 100 languages. The difficulties were tremendous, but the goal was unprecedented. Therefore, the Soviet leaders plunged into that now famous struggle known as the First Five-Year Plan. Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's actually kind of like mind-blowing when you think about the two approaches, because like you can sort of see the logic in both. Like you could see why Trotsky would have this like what seems like almost a Western mindset, which is infiltrate other places, infiltrate your enemies, sabotage them, because that's what the West does. That's what the colonialists and the capitalists do. They infiltrate, they dismantle, they destroy. But Stalin is taking the other tack, and he's saying, no, let's actually just build. Let's like leave them alone, and just build up ourselves. It's like literally like the incel versus the Chad strategy. It's like incels would be like mad at the world, try to take everyone down, and then only destroy themselves at the end. Whereas like the Chad just focuses on himself, just like works on self improvement. Imagine that, but like as a country, nationwide strategy. So back to Stalin and the Chad here. Quote, we could not refrain, said Stalin, from whipping up a country which was 100 years behind, and which, owing to its backwardness, was faced with mortal danger. We would have been unarmed in the midst of a capitalist environment which is armed with modern technique. Yeah. This is quoted by Stalin in his report on the results of the first 5-year plan. Let's see. The world outside the Soviet borders was frankly scornful. Inside the country, much of the peasantry and part of the upper engineering staff was opposed. American engineers who came to help build the new industries often said that the 5-year plan was, quote, utterly logical, but added, quote, if the people, if the people will stand for the sacrifices. Okay, so yeah, it makes sense, but it's going to be a tough toll. These sacrifices were heavy. They included the breakage of large quantities of machinery by sabotage and inefficiency. More serious than that, they included chronic and sometimes acute shortages of every kind of consumer's goods as well as of food. To an unbelieving world, Stalin announced in early 1933 that the former backward peasant Russia had become the world's second industrial country. The number of workers employed in industry had doubled from 11 to 22 million. The volume of industrial output had also doubled. An iron and steel industry of large proportions had been created. Tractors, automobiles, harvester combines, and every variety of modern machine was being produced. They were being produced inefficiently and with tremendous wastage, which caused loud groans from all the American engineer consultants. Quote, we wasted and broke machines, admitted Stalin, but we gained what is more important, time. In the same brief period, some 20 million tiny, uneconomic subsistence farms were combined into 200,000 large farms. By 1940, it was 240,000, based on machine power, division of labor, and scientific methods. At first, they were even less efficiently run than the industries for which they operated under locally elected management, chosen by the farmers who had pooled their lands. For 2 years, farming was dislocated, not as often claimed by Moscow's enforcement of collectivization, but by the fact that local people, eager to be first at the promised tractors, organized collective farms 3 times as fast as the plan had called for, setting up large-scale farming without machines and even without bookkeepers. In 1932 to 33, the whole land went hungry. All food everywhere was rigidly rationed. It has been often called a famine which killed millions of people. But I visited the hungriest parts of the country, and while I found widespread suffering, I did not find, either in individual villages or in the total Soviet census, evidence of the serious depopulation which famine implies. The government met the emergency by drawing on the better trained personnel of industry and sent to the rural districts several thousand of the country's best organizers, factory managers, army officers, agricultural experts, to help organize the farms. The result was at once apparent in the good harvest of 1933. After this, farming rapidly and permanently improved. So yeah, I mean, that's like the long way to explain what people have said for years now. Like since I started getting into this stuff and started like looking into the Soviet Union at all. Like Brett from Red Left is a good person who says this in so many words, that uh, socialism, when you defend socialism or you defend even Stalin as a person, even though we don't do the great man theory, like it was socialism and communism that took the Soviet land, like this backward agrarian Russian feudal state, populated by peasants that had been um, exploited and dominated by these monarchs. He took that in less than a generation to being this like modern industrialized country with like national pride, competing with the US in the space race. And this is how they did that. And it's also because, when you talk about the famines, like people always just think like, oh, commies no food. It's literally like the stereotype. It's like they had one famine and then they didn't have them anymore after that, even though they had been regular occurrences under the SARS. It's like, but people don't have that level of common sense or critical thinking when it comes to any of this stuff. All right, you'd like one more paragraph and then I'll be done for the day. Ominous signs appeared more than once beyond the Soviet borders, threatening war before Soviet preparations could be complete. The Chinese army of Marshal Chang Solin attacked the eastern border in 1929. He was considered a castball for certain imperialist powers. When I went from Moscow to Riga in 1930, the year of the chief drive for farm collectivization, I found all the foreign diplomats watching to see the catastrophic collapse of Soviet farming, which would give the border countries a chance to invade. Most ominous of all was Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, followed by the steady march of her troops to the Soviet border. The Soviet leaders met what they considered an the Soviet leaders met what they considered an imminent danger of war by shifting the emphasis of the 5-year plan toward building a main center of heavy industry in the Ural Mountains and the Kuznets Basin, the practically impregnable part of the country. With the conclusion of the first 5-year plan, the Soviet Union plunged into the second, which did 3 times as much new construction as the first 5-year plan had done, and it did it with much less strain. Soviet industry was completely reorganized and equipped throughout with the latest machines and methods. Greater emphasis was given than previously to producing goods of consumption. This, together with a rapid improvement of farming, caused a fairly swift rise in the general standard of living. Yeah. And I'll remind people once again that the Soviet Union did not suffer from the Great Depression like the West did. They were just pretty much unaffected, which I think we'll probably be getting into a little bit in the next few chapters. But I'm going to wrap it up here for today. Once again, thank you all for joining me. I'll put this out on the podcast feed at some point, and I will see you all